Alright, me. So it is pretty much the exact middle of March, and I, during substitute teaching today, finished A Man for All Seasons by Robert Bolt. There's a couple different versions of this. It was first a play, which is this version, and those turned, I think, two different movies were produced after it. But this is the play version. Specifically, this is in reference to the version that was first produced on Broadway, which was about a year into its run, because it's been a year just in the UK, I believe, before coming over to Broadway. It's a really fascinating piece of literature, right? Because it focuses on a person that I don't think would ever get focused on otherwise, which is a guy by the name of Thomas More. Now, either I forgot this or I was never taught this, right? But Thomas More is a very important person in King Henry VIII and the separation of the Church of England from the Catholic Church, right? So, history lesson, history reminder. The very short deal of it is that Henry VIII was initially married to Queen Catherine of Spain, and she had given birth to a daughter, but had not given birth to any male heirs yet. And so King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from the Queen, right? Because at the time when they were married, it was politically important that they were married, right? But now that that relationship between England and Spain was no longer wanted, as well as the fact that she had not given any male heirs, Henry VIII no longer wanted this marriage. And so he went to the Pope and basically say, I want this nullified. I want this marriage nullified. The Pope refuses, and then that is how we then get the separation of the Catholic Church and then what eventually becomes the Church of England with the king as its head, right? It's because of this whole divorce situation. Now, we of course now get to make fun of King Henry VIII by going, it was actually your fault that there wasn't any male heirs. But that's a story for another time. What's important here is that, right, is that what's happening in the background, all of this, right? It's marriage and things for political reasons. And Thomas More is this very popular and important religious figure that is existing within England at this time. And also within all of this, right, we have this initial situation in which Henry VIII was not supposed to be king, right? Henry VIII had an older brother who was going to be married to, and that older brother was going to be married to Catherine of Spain, right? Queen Catherine. And the older brother, like shortly after that marriage, the older brother dies. And Henry VIII is effectively to just put reign to his place and is then marries Catherine of Spain, right? Which then causes another huge problem, right? Because that is also against religious sanctions, right? Because there's a I don't remember exactly which book and line it is. It gets referenced in the play, but there is a reference to which we're looking at that a person cannot marry their brother's widow, right? And so they go to the church and basically have that rule struck down, that rule ignored, so that the initial marriage can happen. And now that this marriage is no longer convenient, no longer wanted, King Henry VIII it goes back to the Pope and goes, hey, I need you to reinstate this rule so that this marriage never happened, right? And Thomas More's role in this, right? Thomas More, as this very popular Catholic figure in England, the king goes to Thomas More to go like, hey, you need to go to the Pope because you, Thomas More, have more sway in this than I do from a religious standpoint. And Thomas More's response is basically, well, I refuse to do anything, right? Because I refuse to stand ground on whether or not I agree with either the church or the state, right? The state of England. Because he has this staunch loyalty to the king, but he also has this great love and affection towards the Catholic Church. And so he basically gets caught in this middle ground, right? The play itself, as described by Robert Bolt, focuses a great deal on these two interacting forces together, right? And as Robert Bolt describes it in the introduction to this book, is that he views laws and government as how do people want to interact with each other, right? How does one interact and what is the wherewithal within a society? And then he sees religion as how does man interact with themselves, right? And so you're looking at this issue, right, in which you're now intertwining the two, right? How does a man both hold what society and what is expected of him from a culture and what is expected of him from himself, right? And that's what this really all it boils down to, is this conflict between expectations of self versus expectations of a culture and a society. At least that's the way that Bolt describes it. So that's the main thing that's happening here. Thomas More eventually gets kind of effectively entrapped, right? There is another character who is effectively like a king's advisor, but not at the official position. And it basically just trying his best to entrap More into either getting him committed guilty of something, or what eventually happens, right? Which is this weird logic of admittance of guilt, right? That Thomas More, through silence, is saying that he does not agree with the King of England, and therefore, because of the rules at the time, he can be committed for high treason because he disagrees with the king. That whole part is, even though it conducts most of Act 2, is very much just focused on this kind of wording and legality of things, which is, I wouldn't say it's the most interesting thing in the world, right? Coming from someone who has been asked to read legalese since they were 9 or 10 years old or whatever. It's not the most interesting thing in the world, right? It's just a concept of what does the right to remain silent actually mean. It's a question that we still deal with to this day, right? What does it actually mean to be silent in a court of law, right? Does the silence inherently mean guilt from a party, right? And therefore the right to remain silent is therefore null and void. So that's all that, right? That's happening in the background of this, but that's, a whole other thing. And yeah. And to me, like, that's really the story of A Man for All Seasons, right? It's about a man who is so willing to uphold his own virtues and his own belief system that he is willing to sacrifice himself, but also stand up to those that should have also done the same thing, right? And doing it in right? Not doing it in this explicit, I'm going to be loud and I'm going to say, and I'm going to point at all my virtues. It is through I'm going to remain silent and just refuse to cooperate sort of way, um, which is fun. Stop chewing on cords. The structure of the book is interesting because it focuses greatly. Cat. Talk about that. The structure is interesting because it's a 2-act play, but it's structured in a way in which both acts are only technically one scene. It's this older tradition of where like your scenes are continuously ongoing and there's no real like actual differences between the scenes, right? Everything is done in a continuous thing. And all like even your set pieces that move, right, it's all in the middle of the scene that everything's happening, right? So that it's a really interesting way to think about the way that we look at like how do we like look at entertainment, how do we look at, how do we write things and story structures and whatnot, because in every other form, right, you almost always have this idea of breaking it up in some way, right? So that was really interesting. The other really interesting part is this part of what it gets referred to as the common man, and I wouldn't say it's jarring, but it's certainly very, very interesting from if you're not someone who's like really willing to do some absurd things or read or like be like look at some absurd things, because the common man character, right, is really the second focus of all of this, and it's supposed to be played by one person who then continuously changes like their outfits and what they're wearing throughout the entire thing, right, as a physical representation of the common man on all of this, right? And it's because it's one of those things in which when we talk about these huge historical events, right, what we often forget is, right, we look at all these big players and we study and we look at, what they actually do, and then we just kind of ignore the common person, right, of what it means to have existed in this time, what it means to have been doing all this extra other work during this time and just having to exist throughout all of this, right? It's just a thing that I think we often just forget when it comes to this. But so we have the common man who kind of approaches this in both I'm the common man who is playing all these different parts, but is also speaking directly to the audience at certain points, or is making like logistical references to things and whatnot. So it's a very, very fascinating type of character, but also just a really interesting way to look at, once again, how do we actually tell our audience things? Because really, I think if this was in a more traditional set, right, basically all of your times in which you have the common man as, right, the big center focal piece is when you would actually break up your different scenes in your act. Because of those portions are so singularly focused on what this one person is saying as a representation of the entirety of the world that's happening around him. Yeah, I think that's it for Man for All Seasons. Very, very interesting, very short read as well. But yeah.